Professor Stone, it is such a pleasure to have you on our program today. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Virtually every media outlet is talking about war in Ukraine now. Let's do something different here. Let's go back to the beginning. Is there a seminal war or battle in which Russia conquered Ukraine and absorbed it into the Russian Empire?
Well, Adele, thanks. I mean, it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to talk to you today.
Pleasure to have you.
My training was as an historian, and so I'm always happy to talk about the history. One thing I should make clear at the beginning here, though, is that I work for the U.S. government, but I'm not speaking for the U.S. government. All the opinions I'm expressing are strictly my own, not that of the U.S. government or the U.S. Navy.
Sure.
But your question. So you ask, what's the seminal moment at which sort of Russia conquers Ukraine? And this is a history that goes back 1,000 years. And so to find any one moment is difficult. There's always going to be a prehistory. But I think the moment that you can really focus in on, and one that I think illustrates some of the problems that we're facing right now, comes in the middle of the 1600s. There's a moment in Ukraine where Ukraine literally means borderland. It means at the border. And so Ukraine was a bit of a borderland between the Russian Empire and Poland. And so Ukraine kind of falls in between two worlds. There's a Polish kind of cultural world and a Russian cultural world. Russian is Orthodox Christian. Poland is Roman Catholic. And so Ukraine kind of falls in the middle.
And at one point, Poland itself was an empire of some sort, the Lithuanian Polish Empire, right?
Yes, certainly. The Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth was an enormous piece of territory. It's a very large state. And so in a sense, the region that's now Ukraine was kind of caught in between. And in the middle of the 1650s, there's Ukraine is contested between these two regions. And the population of Ukraine at that time consisted in large part of kind of this sort of free roving population of horsemen, mercenaries, hunters, trappers that lived in this region. And they were constantly being pulled back and forth in terms of their allegiance. And in 1654,
those the Cossacks or
the Cossacks, yes, Cossacks.
Okay.
And in 1654, the Cossacks decide to align themselves with Moscow. And there's a treaty, the Treaty of Peryaslav. Peryaslav is a city in present-day Ukraine. And the Treaty of Peryaslav links this Cossack state to Moscow. And the question is, what exactly did the Cossacks agree to? And this is historically contested. From the point of view of the Tsar in Moscow, the Cossacks just signed on to be subject to the Russian Empire. From the Cossack point of view, they signed on to something that was a lot more like an alliance. They were not sort of ceding away all their autonomy, but that became an object of contestation. This is a disagreement between the Cossacks and Moscow about who really holds power. And that jockeying for position and just how much autonomy and freedom Cossacks would have inside the Russian Empire was an ongoing issue. But 1654 is a decent date to start in thinking about how this develops.
So does a battle ensue, or that treaty is sort of sets the stage for subsequent conflict?
Yeah, so essentially what's going on here is a Cossack rebellion against Poland. And the Cossacks invite Russian assistance against Poland. And so Russia joins in this war. Russia joins in a war against Poland. And what's now Ukraine, and the Cossacks of Ukraine, in effect, ally themselves with the Tsar in Moscow.
Is there a moment at which Ukrainians, Cossacks, as you identify them at this moment, sort of realize that they're being subjugated by the Russian Empire, and they start, how do I even term this, armed opposition or insurrection, if you will, by Ukrainians against the Russian Empire?
Well, one good example of this, and a moment that I think sort of gets to the point you're making about Ukrainian resistance to Russian rule, comes, roughly speaking, 50, 60 years after the Treaty of Peryaslav, which links the Cossacks to Moscow.
So we're talking late 1600s, early 1700s.
So this is early 1700s. This is under Peter the Great.
Okay.
And so Peter the Great, again, Russia is in constant struggle against the other empires that it is facing. And Peter the Great finds himself at war with the Swedish Empire. So under King Charles XII, Sweden had formed an empire of its own in Northern Europe, and Sweden and Russia fight the Great Northern War at the beginning of the 1700s. And in the course of that war, Charles XII invades Russia. And in his invasion of Russia, he takes a detour south into what's now Ukraine, and the Cossack loyalty is then up for grabs. And the leader of the Cossacks at that point, he called Hetman, is sort of like headman, but Hetman of the Cossacks is named Ivan Mazepa. And Mazepa's faced with a choice. Technically, he owes loyalty to the Tsar of Moscow, but from Mazepa's point of view, Peter the Great is not defending him. Sweden is invaded. Mazepa makes the decision to ally himself with Charles XII, King of Sweden. And so the Cossacks under Mazepa and Charles XII's Swedish forces fight a major battle against Peter the Great and the Russians at Poltava in 1709.
That's actually the name of a city now in Ukraine.
Yeah,
right?
so Poltava, I mean, the battle was named for a town that was the town of Poltava. Poltava is much bigger now. But yeah, so the Battle of Poltava is named for the then town of Poltava. Charles XII is defeated. The Swedes are defeated. The Cossacks go down to defeat. And Mazepa and Charles XII have to go on the run. Mazepa dies soon after in exile. But that's a moment at which the Cossacks, in a sense, have this moment to try to grab greater autonomy or perhaps even independence. But Peter the Great and the Russians crush that. I mean, Peter the Great wins this battle, Poltava, in 1709, and then is in a position to impose much greater control over Ukraine and the Cossacks and bring them into even tighter orbit around the Russian Tsar.
Before the current crisis, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and treated Crimea as if it's a separate, sort of a distinct region than the rest of Ukraine. I bring this up because it connects to the history that you just shared with me. From sort of reading and perusing Russia's history, to me, a layperson, it seems like in the past, prior czars or even the Soviet Union may have treated Crimea differently in military conflicts. Is that a relatively correct assessment?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things to bear in mind is Russia obviously is enormous. The Russian Empire was enormous, and it contained all sorts of different territories that were acquired by Russia at different times in different ways. And so the acquisition of Crimea is a little different than the acquisition of most of the rest of Ukraine.
How so? How is it different?
So the way that works is that I mentioned Peter the Great earlier. One of Peter the Great's successors is Catherine the Great, who rules Russia at the end of the 1700s. And the reason that Catherine the Great is called the Great is because of extensive territorial conquests. She fights a massive war against the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, sort of centered in Istanbul, controls much of the shores of the Black Sea. And so Catherine the Great's war seizes much of the territory from the Ottoman Turks around the shores of the Black Sea. But also, Catherine is able to take advantage of that moment to annex Crimea. Crimea had been a sort of semi-independent state populated by Tatars, people of Turkish ancestry. And so the Crimean Tatars had been dominant in Crimea.
So they had not been subjugated by Peter the Great in the past. Is that
so? Crimea had been this, in a sense, kind of a buffer state in between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. As a result of this war with the Ottoman Empire, Catherine formally annexes Crimea. It is now part of the Russian Empire under Russian control. And so Crimea was acquired much later than other parts of Ukraine were acquired by the Russian Empire. It's brought in under Catherine at the end of the 1770s. And so its history is a little different. And in addition, its population is different. Now, over time, more Ukrainians and Russians move into Crimea. But at this point, the population, when Catherine annexes it, is largely of Turkish ancestry. And so that changes a bit over time, but there's still a large Turkish population, the Tatar population in Crimea right now.
Interesting. Professor Stone, we talked about Russia conquering Ukraine and the treaty in 1654, and then armed opposition later in the 1700s against Peter the Great's rule, his sort of power struggle with Poland, and the special case of Crimea. I should now ask this sort of logical follow-up questions. Have Russia and Ukraine gone to war against each other in the past?
So yes, I mean, it's a complicated story. And so I apologize. I may end up saying it a lot that it's a complicated story, but the
history seems to be complicated all the time.
It always is. And the ethnic history of Eastern Europe is a very complicated story. So the time to think about an actual Ukrainian-Russian war would be in the context of World War I, and particularly the end of World War I and the breakdown of the Russian Empire. So to kind of summarize the story very briefly, and I'm sure you and many of your listeners will already be aware of this, Russia is fighting in World War I. And under the strains of war, in 1917, the Russian Empire begins to fall apart. There are riots in the capital of St. Petersburg. Tsar Nicholas II abdicates the throne, and Russia begins to disintegrate. Now, in that process, Ukraine declares independence. There's a group of Ukrainian nationalists who declare a new Ukrainian state in kind of the ashes of the old Tsarist empire. Now, Russia, as a result of the 1917 collapse and the subsequent revolutions, Russia disintegrates into civil wars, multiple civil wars with multiple parties. And so Ukraine is fought over repeatedly. Kiev, the capital, changes hands multiple times over the course of a very complicated series of wars. But one aspect of that civil war certainly was Ukrainian nationalists fighting for an independent Ukrainian state against, in particular, communist forces backed by Moscow and Vladimir Lenin's sort of new Soviet government trying to bring Ukraine back under Moscow's control. So one of the things that's interesting, Vladimir Putin, and we're speaking right after Putin's speech in which he declares recognizing these two breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. In the speech that Putin gave, justifying his actions, annexing or sort of recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, he refers to Ukraine as a creation of Vladimir Lenin. And that's fundamentally wrong. Ukrainian nationalism had existed. Ukrainians existed. And the idea of a Ukrainian state existed. And the first Ukrainian state was created in opposition to Lenin, in fighting against Lenin's efforts to bring Ukraine back under control. And so again, sort of Putin's portrayal of the history here, I think, is fundamentally incorrect when he talks about Ukraine as a creation of Vladimir Lenin and a creation of the communists.
Do Russians buy his side of the story?
So
that's a whole different.
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, and it's a difficult question to answer on a variety of grounds. One is, it's hard to know how reliable Russian polling data really is. There are some good polling agents. People are asking good questions. And on some subjects, I think we get good data. But on questions that involve, do you approve of Vladimir Putin's policies? Do you think Putin is a good leader for Russia? Do you approve of what he's doing in Ukraine? I'm not entirely convinced that we can really rely on the numbers that we're getting. That's the first thing to say. The other thing to say is that it is certainly true that for an older generation of Russians, it is hard for them to see Ukraine as a real independent state because Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union for so long. And because many Ukrainians speak Russian, even in parts of, in much of Ukraine, there's a kind of hybrid Ukrainian-Russian language that people speak in day-to-day conversations. It's hard for Russians to imagine that Ukraine is really its own country, especially older generations. Now, Ukraine's been its own country for 30 years. And so for younger people, this is a much easier mental adjustment to make. But older generations would have trouble really buying Ukraine as an independent country. And so it's hard to say just how much Putin's narrative of Ukraine as somehow artificial really resonates. I'm sure it does with some, but by no means all.
We're going to talk more about Mr. Putin in a second. Why don't we take a short break and then talk about Russia's wars on Ukraine's soil with nations other than Ukraine?